former Navy SEAL Grant Mercer had only stopped at Fort Logan National Cemetery to visit the grave of an old teammate. But on his way out, he noticed an aging German Shepherd lying beside the grave of a young Marine. Whenever someone walked past, the dog immediately lifted its head. Then, a few seconds later, it lowered it again in quiet disappointment. Grant assumed it was just a dog grieving its owner, until the groundskeeper told him the young Marine had been buried a year ago. Yet the dog was still there. Every morning it showed up. Every afternoon it remained, as if it still had a reason to stay. What Grant didn't realize was that the dog wasn't only guarding the grave of the fallen Marine. It was waiting to finish the last thing its Marine had left behind. Before we begin, tell us what city you're watching from today. We'd love to know how far this story travels. Late that spring, former Navy SEAL Grant Mercer found himself heading south through Denver toward Fort Logan National Cemetery. At 42, he had attended enough military funerals and memorial services to know that some names never became easier to visit. Colorado carried one of those clear afternoons when the sky seemed larger than usual, the distant mountains sharp against the horizon, and a cool breeze drifted down from the foothills. He drove to Fort Logan National Cemetery just after 3 in the afternoon, wearing a dark field jacket, faded jeans, and boots that had seen too many miles to look new. On the passenger seat lay a small bundle of white flowers wrapped in brown paper, the kind Mason Reed's wife used to bring before she moved to Oregon with the children. Grant had bought them from a grocery store beside the highway, standing in line behind a man arguing over coupons and a woman buying birthday balloons. Life kept moving. The cemetery opened before him in long, quiet rows of white headstones, each one set with the same careful distance from the next. Flags snapped softly in the wind, and somewhere far off, a mower moved across the grass with a low, steady hum. Grant parked near Section 43 and sat there for a moment with both hands resting on the steering wheel, looking out at the place where so many stories had ended without asking permission. He got out slowly. Mason Reed's grave sat near the end of a row that caught the afternoon light. Grant knelt, set the flowers against the stone, and brushed away a few blades of cut grass from the base. The name was still sharp in the marble, but the memory behind it had worn itself into something quieter, something Grant carried without touching unless he had to. "Still here, brother," he said. The wind moved over the grass. Grant stayed there longer than he planned, saying very little because Mason had never liked long speeches anyway. A few visitors passed in the distance, their voices low, their heads bowed. One older man stood with a folded handkerchief pressed to his mouth, and Grant looked away before the moment became something private he had no right to witness. When he finally stood, his knees cracked. He walked back toward the main road that led to the cemetery gate, his pace even, his hands loose at his sides. That was when he saw the dog. At first, it looked like a shadow lying beside one of the stones 2 sections over, still enough to be mistaken for something placed there by a grieving family. Then it lifted its head. The dog was an aging German Shepherd, black and tan with gray along the muzzle and ears that no longer stood as sharply as they must have once done. Its body was lean beneath a rough coat, stoffing, but worn by weather and time. It lay close to a headstone belonging to a young Marine, front paws stretched forward, chin hovering just above the grass. A woman carrying flowers walked past. The dog's head rose immediately. Its eyes followed her with a sudden, careful hope that made Grant stop without meaning to. The woman continued down the row toward another grave, unaware of the animal watching her. After a few seconds, the dog lowered its head again, slow and disappointed, as if whatever it had been waiting for had failed to arrive. Grant stood still. He had seen dogs grieve before. Military working dogs knew absence in ways men often underestimated, and some carried loss with a discipline that looked almost human. But there was something in the way this one watched the path. Something in the pause before it gave up that stayed with him. He looked at the headstone beside it. Tyler Brennan, United States Marine 24. The date below the name sat exactly 1 year behind the afternoon Grant was standing in. Grant read it twice. A year was a long time for anything living to return to the same place. Long enough for seasons to change, for grass to grow back overturned earth, for family visits to become less frequent because life kept demanding its share. He thought of Mason's youngest daughter, who had once tucked a plastic dinosaur beside her father's grave and asked if heaven had room for toys. The dog did not look at him. Grant took a step closer, then stopped. The animal's ears shifted, acknowledging him without invitation. Grant understood boundaries, especially the ones grief built without language. So he left it alone. That night, in his small rented house outside Denver, Grant reheated coffee he never finished and stood by the kitchen window long after the neighborhood went quiet. The house belonged to a friend of a friend, furnished with clean couches, framed mountain prints, and a refrigerator that hummed too loudly after midnight. It should have felt peaceful. It felt borrowed. He tried to read. He tried to sleep. He checked his phone twice, answered nothing, and finally sat at the kitchen table with one hand wrapped around the mug while the image of the dog kept returning. The head lifting, the eyes searching, the slow lowering back to the grass. Grant had stood in enough military funerals to know that the ceremony ended before the grief did. The rifle salute faded, the flag was folded, the chaplain closed his book, and people shook hands in parking lots because no one knew what else to do. Then mothers went home to bedrooms that still smelled faintly of laundry detergent and aftershave. Wives faced mail addressed to men who would never open it, and dogs waited beside doors for boots that would not cross the threshold again. By 5:30, he stopped pretending he had slept. The next morning came pale and cool, with thin clouds hanging over the Front Range and traffic already building along Sheridan Boulevard. Grant had an errand in Lakewood, a simple appointment he had written down 2 days earlier. He stopped at a red light with one hand on the wheel, watching brake lights blink ahead of him. When the light turned green, he did not drive straight. He turned right. The road bent him back toward Fort Logan before he had admitted to himself where he was going. He told himself he had forgotten something at Mason's grave, though he could not have named what. By the time he reached the cemetery gate, the excuse had already worn thin. A man in a khaki work shirt stood near a small utility cart by the entrance, wiping his hands on a rag. He had a broad, weathered face, silver hair tucked under a cap, and the easy posture of someone who had spent years walking among the dead without becoming afraid of them. He watched Grant's truck roll in, then lifted 2 fingers in greeting. "You were here yesterday," the man said. Grant stepped out. "That obvious? Son, around here I remember the living because they're the ones who keep moving around." The man gave a dry smile and offered a hand. Harold Finch. Day groundskeeper, unofficial tour guide, occasional listener for folks who need to talk to somebody quiet. Grant shook his hand. Grant Mercer. Military, former Navy. Harold nodded as if that explained Grant's silence better than any longer answer could. "You forget something?" Grant looked past him toward the rows of stones. "Maybe." Harold followed his gaze. "You mean the dog?" Grant did not answer right away. The older man sighed, not with annoyance, but with the tired familiarity of someone who had watched the same sorrow repeat itself too many mornings. "Yeah, everybody notices him the first time. He belonged to someone used to, I suppose." Harold leaned against the cart. "He showed up the day that young Marine was buried, been coming ever since." Grant looked at him. "Every day?" "Every day." Harold tucked the rag into his back pocket. "Rain, snow, heat bad enough to fry an egg on the sidewalk. Doesn't matter. He's there." The wind pushed softly through the flag line. Harold scratched his jaw and glanced toward the burial sections. "People leave him water sometimes. Food too. I've done it myself plenty. Management called animal rescue a few times early on, but that dog fought like the whole Marine Corps was trying to drag him off post. They took him once, and he was back before the next morning." Grant's eyes narrowed slightly. "Back here, same grave." Harold gave a small laugh that carried more sadness than humor. "At this point, I figure he's the most reliable employee we've got. 1 year on duty and hasn't asked for a weekend." Grant almost smiled, almost. He walked toward Section 52 with Harold a few steps behind him. The German Shepherd lay exactly where Grant had seen it the day before, pressed close to Tyler Brennan's grave, eyes half open in the morning light. When Grant approached, the dog lifted its head and looked at him. For one breath it waited, then its gaze dimmed. Grant stopped at the foot of the grave and read the name again, slower this time. Tyler Brennan, 24 years old, United States Marine Corps, gone 1 year. A young man with a short life now reduced to carved letters, polished stone, and a dog that still refused to leave. Grant bowed his head. He did not know Tyler Brennan. He did not know the Marine's voice, his laugh, the way he held a rifle, or whether he called home every Sunday like some did and some wished they had. But Grant knew the shape of that kind of loss, and for a moment, standing there in the Colorado wind, the distance between one fallen man and another felt very small. The dog lowered its chin to the grass. Grant stayed longer than he meant to, longer than he understood. Before we find out why the old German Shepherd keeps returning to the same grave every day, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Grant stayed beside Tyler Brennan's grave for several more minutes before finally turning away. The Colorado wind moved softly through the grass, carrying the distant hum of traffic from beyond the cemetery walls. Behind him, the German Shepherd lowered its head once more and settled into the same patch of ground it seemed to know by heart. The image followed him home. Over the next few days, Grant found himself driving back to Fort Logan more often than he intended. At first, he told himself it was coincidence. The cemetery happened to be near places he needed to go. The route happened to be convenient. The extra 10 minutes didn't matter. The excuses lasted about 3 days. By the 4th, he was stopping at a grocery store before each visit. Bottled water, plain roasted chicken, a few cans of dog food, some treats he wasn't even sure the dog would like. An old wool blanket stayed folded behind the seat of his truck just in case. The dog never rushed to greet him. Each afternoon, Grant found it in the same place beside Tyler's grave. Sometimes it would glance at him before returning its attention to the cemetery gate. Other times it barely acknowledged his presence at all. Grant respected that. He left food a few feet away and sat down on the grass without trying to move closer. Some days he talked, some days he didn't. There seemed to be no rule to it. One afternoon he found himself describing a deployment off the Horn of Africa. The kind of story that would have sounded strange if anyone else had overheard it. Another day he talked about Mason Reed and the practical jokes he used to pull during training exercises. Once he spent nearly an hour saying nothing, while a warm breeze pushed white clouds across the Colorado sky. The dog stayed. That was enough. A week passed. Then another. By then, the dog no longer moved away when Grant approached. It allowed him to place food directly in front of it. It allowed him to sit nearby. One evening, after finishing most of a container of chicken, it even let Grant run a hand gently across the gray fur along its neck. The dog didn't lean into the touch, but it didn't leave either, Harold noticed. The older groundskeeper stood watching from his utility cart one afternoon with a paper coffee cup balanced on one knee. A grin spread across his weathered face. "You know," he called out, "I've been trying to make friends with that mutt for almost a year." Grant glanced up. Harold pointed toward the dog. "You show up for a couple weeks and suddenly you're the favorite." The dog ignored both of them. Harold chuckled. "Story of my life." For the first time in several days, Grant laughed. The sound surprised him. That evening, the cemetery grew quiet as the last visitors drifted toward the exit. Long shadows stretched between the rows of white headstones. Somewhere in the distance, a flag rope tapped rhythmically against a metal pole. Grant watched the dog finish drinking from a bowl of water. Then something changed. The dog stood, not abruptly, not urgently, simply stood and turned away from the grave. Grant frowned. During all the days he had been coming here, he had never actually seen what happened when evening arrived. The dogs started walking. Toward the gate, toward the parking lot, toward him. Grant remained still. The dog stopped several feet away and looked at him. For a moment, neither moved. Then Grant heard Harold's voice from across the road. "Well, I'll be damned." The old groundskeeper shook his head. "I've never seen that before." The dog took another step, then another. Grant looked down at the German Shepherd. "You coming?" The dog's ears twitched. A few minutes later, it climbed into the back seat of Grant's truck without resistance. Even Harold seemed speechless. The drive home passed quietly. The setting sun painted the western sky orange and gold as the truck rolled through Denver traffic. Every few minutes, Grant glanced in the rearview mirror. The dog sat calmly in the back, watching. When they arrived, the dog hesitated at the front door. It sniffed the porch, the welcome mat, and the corners of the frame before finally stepping inside. The house was unfamiliar territory. Every room required inspection. The kitchen, the hallway, the living room, the guest bedroom. The dog moved carefully through each one, nose close to the floor, gathering information in the way dogs always did. Grant let it take its time. Eventually, he filled a large bowl with water and prepared a proper meal. The dog ate quickly, though not frantically, then wandered into the living room, where a small fireplace cast warm light across the floor. Grant spread the old blanket nearby. The dog lay down, then stood up again. A few minutes later it moved to a different corner. Then another, as if trying to decide where it belonged. Near midnight the house finally grew quiet. The dishwasher clicked softly in the kitchen. A train horn echoed faintly somewhere beyond the city. Grant fell asleep in the recliner without realizing it. Several hours later, he woke. Something felt different. The blanket was empty. Grant sat upright. The dog wasn't near the fireplace. It wasn't in the hallway either. A faint glow from the street lamp outside filtered through the living room window. There it was. The German Shepherd sat beside the glass, perfectly still, watching the darkness beyond the yard. Grant followed its gaze. There was nothing there, just empty streets and distant porch lights. The dog remained motionless. Grant said nothing. After a while, he returned to bed. For a few brief hours, he allowed himself to believe the hardest part was over. The next morning proved otherwise. Before sunrise, a scratching sound pulled him awake. The dog. It stood by the front door. Scratching again. Grant checked the clock, 4:47 a.m. He opened the door. The German Shepherd bolted past him. "Hey!" Grant stepped onto the porch. The dog never slowed. It disappeared into the fading darkness at the end of the street before he could reach his truck. For the next hour, Grant searched nearby roads and neighborhoods. He checked parks, side streets, empty lots. Nothing. The answer arrived later that morning. By then, the Colorado sun was climbing over the horizon, warming the grass between the rows of white headstones at Fort Logan National Cemetery. Grant parked near Section 52. He already knew what he was going to find. The German Shepherd lay exactly where it always had, beside Tyler Brennan's grave. Its head rested on its paws, its eyes fixed quietly on the cemetery gate, as if the previous night had never happened at all. The German Shepherd was still lying beside Tyler Brennan's grave when Grant left Fort Logan that morning. The dog had returned before sunrise. It had crossed half the city to reach the cemetery. Then it had settled into the same patch of grass as if the previous night had never happened. Grant couldn't stop thinking about it. For several days, he tried to convince himself there was nothing unusual about the situation. Dogs grieved. Dogs formed routines. Dogs returned to familiar places. Every explanation sounded reasonable when he was driving home. They sounded less convincing when he stood beside the grave. The dog wasn't simply resting there. It was waiting. A week earlier, Grant would have dismissed that thought as sentimentality. Years in the military had taught him to distrust easy explanations. But the longer he watched the dog, the more a single detail continued to bother him. Every time footsteps approached from the cemetery entrance, the dog looked up. Every single time. It didn't matter whether the visitor was young or old. It didn't matter whether they carried flowers, photographs, or folded flags. For a brief moment, the dog seemed hopeful, then disappointed. The pattern never changed. One afternoon, Grant sat on the tailgate of his truck with his phone in hand, staring at Tyler Brennan's name on a notepad. Beyond the parking lot, a flag cracked sharply in the wind. The sky above Denver carried the deep blue color Colorado was known for, almost too bright against the white headstones. Something wasn't fitting. That evening, he called an old friend named Aaron Whitaker, a veteran service officer he had known for years through veteran support programs. Aaron answered on the second ring. "Please tell me you're calling to buy me dinner." Grant smiled. "I'm looking for information." "Of course you are." A few minutes later, Aaron was typing. Military records weren't public in the way people imagined, but family contact information, survivor records, and veteran assistance files often left trails that could be followed through legitimate channels. Grant explained what little he knew. Tyler Brennan, 24, Marine, buried at Fort Logan 1 year earlier. Aaron promised to see what he could find. The call came back the next morning. "Got an address," Aaron said. Grant grabbed a pen. "Family, mother, Evelyn Brennan." Aaron read the information slowly. Grant wrote it down. Colorado Springs, a residential neighborhood on the eastern side of town. The drive took a little over an hour. The farther south he traveled, the more the city gave way to quiet subdivisions, wide streets, and small homes built decades earlier. The address led him to a single-story house with faded blue siding and a front yard that looked forgotten. The grass had grown high enough to bend in the wind. Weeds pushed through cracks in the driveway. The mailbox bulged with old advertisements and unopened flyers. Nobody had lived there for a long time. Grant remained by the curb for a moment. Then he walked toward the neighboring house. A woman in her 70s was watering flowers beside her porch when she noticed him approaching. She wore gardening gloves and a sun hat decorated with artificial daisies. "Can I help you?" she asked. Grant introduced himself. The moment he mentioned Tyler Brennan, her expression changed. Recognition arrived immediately. "Oh," she said quietly. "Tyler." The hose continued trickling water onto the flower bed. For a moment neither spoke. Then the woman shut off the nozzle. "I haven't heard that name in a while." She invited Grant onto the porch and pointed toward the abandoned house next door. Tyler had been Evelyn Brennan's only child. A good son, according to the neighbor. The kind who fixed fences without being asked and carried groceries for people twice his age. After Tyler's death, everything changed. The neighbor's voice softened as she spoke. The funeral had drawn people from across the state. Marines had stood at attention. Flags had been folded. Speeches had been given. Then everyone went home. A few weeks later, Evelyn suffered a severe stroke. She survived, but she never returned to the house. The rehabilitation facility in Pueblo became her new address. The porch fell quiet. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower started. Grant looked again at the empty home. The curtains behind the windows hadn't moved in months. The neighbor followed his gaze. She loved that place. A breeze rattled the wind chimes hanging beside the porch. Then Grant asked about the dog. The woman nodded immediately. Of course. For the first time, the German Shepherd had a name. Ranger. Grant repeated it silently. Ranger. The neighbor smiled faintly. Tyler brought him home after one of his assignments. Said his mother needed company while he was away. She looked toward the abandoned house. Those two were inseparable. Grant listened. Ranger had lived there with Evelyn, walked the neighborhood, slept on the porch during summer evenings, followed her from room to room. Then Evelyn disappeared, and so did Ranger. The neighbor rested both hands on the railing. Every now and then I'd see him. Grant looked up. See him where? Late at night. Walking through the neighborhood. She paused, never staying. The words lingered between them. He'd appear for a few minutes, walk past the house, stop near the driveway. Her eyes drifted toward the empty property. Then he'd leave again. Grant said nothing. The woman looked almost embarrassed by what she was about to say. It always felt like he was looking for someone. The wind shifted across the street. For several seconds, only the sound of distant traffic remained. Grant thanked her and returned to his truck. The driver's door stood open. The address Aaron had given him remained folded in his pocket. He should have felt closer to an answer. Instead, he felt farther away than before. The drive back toward Denver passed beneath a sky streaked with thin white clouds. Traffic moved steadily along Interstate 25. Mile after mile rolled beneath the tires. Grant's thoughts kept returning to Fort Logan. To Tyler's grave. To Ranger. To the way the dog lifted its head whenever footsteps approached from the cemetery gate. The dog had never abandoned Tyler. That much was obvious. It returned to the grave every day. It guarded the place where its Marine rested. But perhaps that wasn't the whole story. Grant thought about Evelyn Brennan. He thought about a stroke, a rehabilitation facility, an empty house, a dog wandering through the neighborhood after dark. The pieces didn't quite fit yet, but for the first time he could see the outline of something larger than grief. As if Ranger had spent the past year waiting for more than one person. As if somewhere in the dog's memory, another figure still belonged beside that grave. Someone who had once stood there with him, and never came back. The drive to Pueblo took nearly 2 hours. Grant left Denver before sunrise, following Interstate 25 south through open stretches of Colorado where the sky seemed wider than the land beneath it. Ranch fences rolled past in long lines. Wind turbines turned slowly in the distance. The radio stayed off. Some thoughts traveled better in silence. The rehabilitation center sat on the edge of town beside a small medical complex. It wasn't the kind of place people imagined when they heard the word recovery. There were no dramatic scenes, no miraculous breakthroughs, just nurses changing shifts, wheelchairs moving down hallways, and families trying to hold on to pieces of life that illness had rearranged. Grant parked and walked inside. The receptionist directed him to the long-term rehabilitation wing. The hallway smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. Sunlight filtered through large windows overlooking a courtyard filled with flowering shrubs. Somewhere nearby, a television played softly. The volume was low enough that nobody seemed to be watching it. A nurse met him outside room 214. "Evelyn Brennan?" Grant asked. The woman nodded. Family? No, she studied him for a second. Then something in his expression seemed to answer the question she hadn't asked. The nurse stepped aside. Evelyn Brennan sat beside the window. She looked smaller than Grant expected. Her silver hair had been brushed neatly back, and a light blanket covered her legs despite the warmth of the room. On the small table beside her bed stood a framed photograph, a young Marine in dress uniform, standing beside a German Shepherd. Grant recognized the dog immediately. Ranger, younger, stronger, his muzzle still dark. The photograph had been handled so often that the corners were beginning to fade. Evelyn didn't notice Grant at first. She was looking out the window toward the parking lot below. Waiting, the nurse lowered her voice. Some days are better than others. Grant nodded. The woman glanced toward the photograph. She talks about her son a lot. The nurse folded her hands. Sometimes she asks when he's coming home. A wheelchair rolled past in the hallway. The room fell quiet again. Sometimes she says she heard his truck in the driveway. The nurse offered a sad smile. And a few minutes later she'll ask us where he is. Grant listened. The nurse hesitated before continuing. Then she starts asking questions. What kind of questions? The woman looked toward Evelyn. She asks who's feeding him. Grant frowned. The nurse continued. She asks whether he's cold. Another pause. She asks us to find him and bring him home. Grant looked back at the photograph. His eyes settled on Ranger. For a long time, nobody had understood who Evelyn was talking about. Then the pieces began fitting together. The nurse eventually excused herself, leaving Grant alone with the elderly woman. Outside, clouds drifted slowly across the Colorado sky. Inside, only the ticking of a wall clock broke the silence. Grant stepped closer. Evelyn, her eyes moved toward him. For a moment, confusion crossed her face. Then he said softly, "I've seen your dog." Everything changed. The reaction was immediate. The uncertainty disappeared from her eyes. She reached for his hand with surprising urgency. "You've seen Tyler?" Grant felt a knot tighten in his chest. The names lived too close together inside her memory now. Sometimes they overlapped. Sometimes they became one. He sat beside her. "I've seen him." Tears appeared instantly, the kind that arrive before a person even realizes they're crying. Evelyn squeezed his hand. "Is he still sleeping under the porch when it rains?" Grant swallowed. The photograph sat only a few feet away. A Marine, a dog, a mother. 3 lives connected by something war had never intended to break. "Sometimes," Grant said quietly. Evelyn nodded. A faint smile touched her face. He always hated thunderstorms. She looked toward the window, as if seeing another time entirely. Tyler used to laugh because he'd climb right into the house the moment the thunder started. Grant listened. The stories came slowly. Not in order, not always clearly. Fragments of birthdays, fishing trips, barbecues, a puppy chasing tennis balls across a backyard. A Marine son who never forgot to call his mother. A dog who followed her everywhere. The morning sunlight shifted across the floor. Hours passed. Neither seemed to notice. Eventually Grant stood. Evelyn looked up immediately. Fear flickered across her face. "Will you find him?" The room felt very still. Grant thought about Fort Logan, about the white headstone, about Ranger lifting his head every time someone approached the cemetery gate. About a year of waiting. He didn't tell her he would try. He didn't tell her he would see what he could do. Instead, he gave the only answer that felt honest. "I'll bring him to you." Evelyn closed her eyes. A single tear rolled down her cheek. "Thank you." The drive back to Denver happened beneath gathering clouds. By late afternoon, the weather had changed. Gray skies spread across the Front Range. Wind pushed across the highway hard enough to shake the truck occasionally. Grant arrived at Fort Logan just before closing time. The cemetery was nearly empty. A few visitors remained near the far sections. Harold's utility cart sat parked beside a maintenance building. And Ranger was exactly where he always was, beside Tyler Brennan. The dog lifted its head when Grant approached, then lowered it again. Grant sat on the grass. The air smelled faintly of rain. Rows of white heads stretched across the hillside. For a long time, neither moved. Grant spoke quietly. About Evelyn, about the empty house, about the photograph beside her bed, about the questions she still asked. The wind carried his words away. The dog listened, or maybe it simply stayed. Sometimes that was enough. Darkness settled slowly across the cemetery. The final visitors left. A distant gate closed. Grant eventually rose to his feet. The moment had arrived. He turned toward the parking lot. The gravel crunched beneath his boots. Several steps passed, then more. Behind him, nothing moved. Grant reached the truck, opened the door. Waited. A soft sound came from the darkness. He looked back. Ranger was standing. The German Shepherd glanced once toward Tyler's grave. Then toward Grant. The wind moved through the grass. For several seconds, neither took another step. Then Ranger started walking. Slowly, deliberately, toward the truck. The drive south felt different this time. Neither of them looked back. It was nearly dark when they reached Pueblo. The rehabilitation center remained open, though most visitors had already gone home. Warm light spilled from the front entrance onto the pavement. Grant opened the truck door. Ranger stepped out, then stopped. Every muscle in his bottom eye tightened. His ears rose, his nose lifted toward the air. Something familiar lingered there. Something he hadn't sensed in a very long time. The automatic doors slid open. Ranger froze. The world seemed to narrow into a single moment. Then he ran. The hallway echoed with a rapid sound of claws striking polished floors. Nurses turned. Patients looked up. Someone called out in surprise. Ranger ignored everything. Room 214. The dog reached the doorway and stopped only long enough to confirm what his senses already knew. Then he launched forward. Evelyn cried out, not in fear, in recognition. Her arms wrapped around his neck as tightly as her strength allowed. Ranger pressed himself against her, whining softly, his entire body trembling. Tears streamed down Evelyn's face. She buried her hands in his fur. For several seconds, neither seemed willing to let go. A young nurse standing nearby covered her mouth. Understanding arrived all at once. The questions, the waiting, the confusion, the grief. For the first time, she understood who Evelyn had been searching for all along. The reunion should have felt like an ending. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something quieter. Over the following weeks, Grant found himself driving to Pueblo more often than Fort Logan. The route became familiar. South on Interstate 25, exit near the medical complex. The same parking lot, the same automatic doors opening with a soft mechanical sigh. Ranger learned the routine before he did. The moment Grant turned into the facility entrance, the German Shepherd would lift his head and move closer to the truck door. By the time they reached Evelyn's room, his tail was already moving, slowly, steadily, like a metronome keeping time. Some afternoons, Grant wheeled Evelyn into the small garden behind the building. The courtyard wasn't large, but it held enough life to make people linger. Flower beds lined the walking paths. Sparrows hopped beneath the benches. A maple tree near the fence cast a patch of shade that shifted gradually throughout the day. Evelyn liked that spot. So did Ranger. The dog would settle beside her wheelchair while she rested one hand on his back. Sometimes she spoke for an hour. Sometimes only a few minutes. The stories came and went like old songs returning from another room. There was always Tyler. Tyler learning to ride a bicycle. Tyler bringing home muddy baseball uniforms. Tyler leaving for boot camp. Tyler calling home from places she couldn't pronounce. Grant listened, even when he had heard the story before. Especially then. There were days when Evelyn forgot she had already told him about Tyler catching frogs in a creek behind their old house. Days when she laughed at the memory, only to tell the same story again 20 minutes later. Grant never interrupted. Some memories deserved a second hearing, or a third, or 100th. The seasons shifted almost without anyone noticing. Summer slowly gave way to early autumn. The Colorado air grew cooler in the mornings. Leaves began gathering along sidewalks and parking lots. The sunlight arrived later and left earlier. Yet certain things never changed. Ranger beside Evelyn, Evelyn's hand resting in his fur, Grant sitting nearby, together. One afternoon, none of them spoke for nearly an hour. The three of them sat beneath the maple tree while sunlight drifted across the grass in slow golden bands. A nurse passed with a resident in a wheelchair. Somewhere beyond the fence, children shouted from a nearby park. The world continued moving. The moment didn't need to. As the weeks passed, Grant began noticing something else. The tension that had lived inside Ranger for so long was fading. The dog still watched doors, still lifted his head when footsteps approached. But he no longer seemed trapped between two places, no longer divided between the grave and the woman who had disappeared. The waiting had finally ended. One evening in early autumn, Grant arrived later than usual. The sky beyond the windows glowed amber and purple as the sun disappeared behind distant hills. The rehabilitation wing had grown quiet. Most visitors had already gone home. Evelyn sat in her chair beside the window. Ranger rested beside her, The room smelled faintly of tea and lavender lotion. Grant paused outside the doorway. Neither had noticed him yet. Evelyn's hand moved slowly along Ranger's back. Again and again. The dog remained perfectly still. For a moment the scene felt too private to interrupt. Then he heard her speaking. Not loudly. Just above a whisper. "Thank you, sweetheart." Her fingers disappeared into the thick fur around Ranger's neck. "Thank you for staying." The room fell silent for several seconds. Outside, the first stars were appearing. Evelyn smiled faintly. "You waited longer than anyone should have." Grant looked away. Some things belonged only to the people living them. A few minutes later, he stepped inside. They spent the rest of the evening together. No dramatic conversations, no final speeches. Just stories, small ones, the kind families tell when they stop trying to fix the past and simply sit beside it. By 9 o'clock, Evelyn looked tired. Grant helped adjust her blanket while a nurse prepared her medications for the night. Ranger remained close to her chair. Before leaving, Grant bent down and scratched behind the dog's ears. "I'll see you tomorrow." Ranger watched him leave. The next morning began differently. A little after 6, Grant's phone rang. The number belonged to the rehabilitation center. Even before answering, he knew. The voice on the other end was gentle. Evelyn Brennan had passed away peacefully in her sleep. Grant arrived in Pueblo less than 2 hours later. The morning sky was gray. A light rain tapped against the windows. Room 214 stood open. The nurses had already done what needed to be done, but Ranger remained. The German Shepherd lay beside the bed with his head resting against the edge of the mattress. One paw touched the blanket as if maintaining contact mattered. No one tried to move him. No one rushed him. Grant stood quietly in the doorway. The dog looked up once, then lowered his head again. The room stayed silent. A few days later, family friends, former neighbors, and several local veterans gathered for Evelyn's funeral. The service was simple, exactly as she would have wanted. Stories were shared, tears appeared, laughter appeared too. Life rarely separated the two. Ranger sat beside Grant through the entire service. The dog never pulled against the leash, never wandered, never barked, he simply stayed. Afterward, Grant completed the adoption paperwork. The process was straightforward. Most of the staff already knew him. More importantly, Ranger had made his choice long ago. The first evening back at the house felt strangely different. The rooms were familiar now. The water bowl stood in its usual place. The blanket remained near the fireplace. Outside, autumn rain tapped softly against the windows. Grant sat in the recliner while Ranger settled on the rug nearby. For a while, neither moved. The fire crackled quietly. The house breathed around them. Grant looked at the aging German Shepherd for a long time. At the gray muzzle, the tired eyes. The dog who had guarded a grave for a year. The dog who had waited when everyone else believed the waiting was over. Eventually, Grant leaned forward and rested his forearms on his knees. Ranger lifted his head. Their eyes met. "You don't have to wait anymore, Ranger." The dog remained still. "You finished the mission." The fire popped softly behind them. Rain continued tapping against the glass. Grant smiled. A small one. The kind that carried more gratitude than happiness. From here on out, he reached down and scratched the fur beneath Ranger's chin. "I'll take the watch. Before you go, I'd love to ask you something. Have you ever had someone, or even a dog, who stayed loyal to you during a season when life felt heavy? If this story brought a memory to mind, feel free to share it in the comments. Many people reading may understand that feeling more than you realize. And if you enjoy quiet stories about people, animals, and the connections that help us keep going, I hope you'll consider liking and subscribing. One thing I kept thinking about after this story ended was how rarely we notice the people who are still waiting. We talk a lot about the heroes who leave, but not always about the ones who remain behind. The parent who keeps a photograph by the window. The neighbor who remembers a name years later. The groundskeeper who leaves out a bowl of water. The dog who returns to the same place every morning because love has become part of his routine. This story is fictional, but the emotions inside it are not. Military families, caregivers, widows, aging parents, and loyal companions live versions of these moments every day. The details change. The ache is often familiar. As for me, I keep picturing a quiet rehabilitation room at the end of a long day. A fading photograph on a bedside table. A hand resting on a dog's back. No speeches, no grand discoveries. Just two souls finally finding each other again after a year of waiting. Sometimes the closest thing to a miracle isn't something that appears. It's something that finally comes home.